The forum thread had already been marked as resolved, which in practice meant no one had actually agreed on anything, but everyone had grown too tired to continue arguing. Ven scrolled through the last few replies with mild irritation, tapping his fingers against the edge of his console as if that might somehow improve the quality of the physics being discussed. It didn't. Someone had once again insisted that microfold transit lanes could be stabilized with predictive optimism, which was not only incorrect but offensively vague. Ven sighed, leaned back in his chair, and considered closing the thread. He had work to do, actual work, involving real systems that either functioned or failed without caring about theoretical debates. But then he saw a new reply. It was concise, clean, precise in a way that immediately stood out against the surrounding noise. The user's name was Sai. She dismantled the flawed argument in 6 sentences. Not aggressively, not dismissively, but with the kind of clarity that made it impossible to argue back without sounding foolish. She referenced a transit corridor collapse that Ven vaguely remembered reading about months ago, something that had happened far beyond the sectors he cared about. And she described it not as an abstract event, but as if she had seen the data firsthand, or worse, experienced it. Ven leaned forward again, interest replacing irritation. He reread her reply once, then again. Okay, he muttered to himself. Either you're very confident, or you've actually been out there. He typed a response before he could overthink it. If predictive optimism worked, my docking clamps would fix themselves when I stared at them long enough. They don't. I've tried. What you're describing sounds closer to dynamic field compensation, but your numbers seem suspiciously stable. Are you rounding, or am I missing something? He hesitated for half a second, then sent it. There was a particular kind of silence that followed posting on a forum like this. Not the absence of sound, but the waiting, an invisible pause where the conversation either died quietly or shifted into something worth continuing. Ven expected nothing. Most people either ignored replies that challenged them or doubled down with increasingly creative misunderstandings. Sai responded 3 minutes later. I am not rounding. Your assumption about field variance is based on outdated models. The corridor you mentioned did not fail because of instability. It failed because someone attempted to correct it mid-transition. There is a difference. Ven blinked. He smiled. Right, he said softly, as if she could hear him through the screen. Of course there is. He typed again, this time slower. So the lesson is, don't fix something while you're inside it. I feel like that applies to more than transit corridors. There was a longer pause this time, long enough that Ven stood up, walked to the small dispenser in the corner of his apartment, and poured himself something that claimed to be coffee, but tasted like it had once offended a real bean. He took a sip, made a face, and returned to his console just as her reply appeared. It does, Sai wrote, though people rarely follow that lesson. Ven let out a quiet laugh. Well, if people followed good advice consistently, half this forum wouldn't exist. He didn't expect the conversation to continue beyond that. It had already exceeded the usual lifespan of a reasonable exchange. But it did continue. Not immediately, not in a way that felt forced, but naturally, like two people who had found, without planning to, that they could speak without needing to perform. Over the next hour, the thread stopped mattering. Other users tried to pull the discussion back into its original argument, but Ven ignored them. Sai did too. Their replies became less about proving points and more about refining them, testing ideas against each other with a kind of quiet precision that felt comfortable. At one point, Ven wrote, if you're right, then half the simulations we use in the outer sectors are built on assumptions that shouldn't work. Sai responded, they do not work. They function. There is a difference. Ven stared at that for a moment, then nodded to himself. Functioning incompetence, he typed. That explains a lot about my job. This time her reply came with something new, a hint of humor. Then you are very experienced. Ven laughed, louder than he expected. Hey, he said to the empty room, I prefer the term adaptively surviving. It sounds more impressive. The conversation drifted after that, away from strict theory and into the edges of it. Sai mentioned long routes and unpredictable sectors, always in passing, never with detail. Ven talked about the settlement, about the endless cycle of minor repairs and small victories that defined his days. He described at one point the ongoing argument over whether the station's background music should be instrumental or whatever nonsense Carol keeps uploading. Sai asked, "What does Carol upload?" Ven paused, then typed carefully. "I don't know how to describe it. Imagine if rhythm had a personal grudge against structure." There was a delay, then, "I would like to hear this." Ven shook his head, smiling. "No, you wouldn't. No one does. That's the problem." Hours passed without either of them noticing. The artificial lighting in Ven's apartment shifted subtly to indicate evening cycle, but he ignored it. The form around them continued to churn with arguments and corrections and quiet misunderstandings, but their conversation remained steady, unaffected by the noise. At some point, Ven realized he wasn't thinking about what to say next. He was just saying it. That more than anything was unusual. When the exchange finally slowed, it wasn't because they had run out of things to discuss, but because the rhythm of it had settled into something sustainable. Sai's last message that cycle was simple. "I will be traveling near your sector soon." Ven read it once, then again. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the words as if they might rearrange themselves into something less significant. They didn't. He typed a response, erased it, then typed another. "You should stop by," he wrote. "The coffee is terrible, but I make a decent soup." He hovered over the send command, suddenly aware that this was, in some small way, a step beyond the easy distance of conversation. Then he shrugged. "Worst case," he muttered. "She says no, and I still have soup." He sent it. The reply came faster than he expected. "I would like that." Ven exhaled, not realizing until that moment that he had been holding his breath. He glanced around his apartment, at the unremarkable walls, the slightly uneven table, the dispenser that had just betrayed him with its version of coffee, and nodded once, as if confirming a decision that had already been made. "Well," he said quietly, "I guess I should clean." Ven stood in the middle of his apartment and tried to see it the way someone else would. This turned out to be a mistake almost immediately. He turned slowly, hands on his hips, narrowing his eyes at the wall panel as if it had personally disappointed him. The wall panel, unchanged by judgment, continued being a wall panel. "Right," he said. "We're not starting strong." He had always considered the place functional. Not beautiful, not impressive, but functional in the way that mattered when your daily concerns involved pressure seals and thermal drift rather than aesthetic harmony. Now, for reasons he refused to examine too closely, he was suddenly aware of every minor imperfection. The table had a slight tilt to the left. The lighting strip above the kitchenette flickered once every few minutes, as if it were thinking about failing, but hadn't committed yet. The air filter hummed with a tone that could, under the right conditions, be described as concerning. Ven pointed at the ceiling. "You," he said, "are going to behave." The ceiling, much like the wall panel, declined to respond. He exhaled, ran a hand through his hair, and moved with purpose. Cleaning, he decided, would be approached scientifically, not emotionally, not impulsively, scientifically. This lasted approximately 3 minutes. By the 4th minute, he was crouched under the table, manually adjusting one of the support legs while muttering, "You had one job, be a table." The table did not apologize. He stood up, tested it, watched it wobble slightly, then nodded as if he had reached an agreement with it. "Acceptable," he said. "Not good, but acceptable." The cleaning continued. Surfaces were wiped, recalibrated, and in one case politely threatened. Ven opened a maintenance panel near the air filter and stared at the internal components with the expression of someone who knew just enough to be dangerous. "Don't embarrass me," he told it. The filter responded by emitting a slightly different hum, which Ven chose to interpret as cooperation. At some point he paused and leaned against the counter, glancing at the small console where their messages still lingered. Sai would be arriving soon, not immediately, but soon enough that the concept had shifted from abstract to inconveniently real. He frowned slightly. "What do I actually know about her?" he asked aloud. The answer, when considered honestly, was not much. She was precise, observant, occasionally amused. She spoke about deep space transit like someone who had lived inside it, and she had agreed without hesitation to visit a man whose primary offering was soup. Ven nodded slowly. Either you're very confident, he said, or I'm about to become a very educational mistake. He pushed himself off the counter and returned to the task at hand. The kitchen, if it could be called that, was the next battlefield. He opened storage compartments, inspected ingredients, and began assembling what would eventually become the soup. It was not an ambitious dish. It was not meant to be. It was reliable, adaptable, and forgiving of minor errors, which made it ideal for a situation where Ven was already compensating for variables he did not understand. As he worked, he found himself talking again, this time to the pot. Okay, he said, stirring with unnecessary intensity. We're not trying to impress anyone. We're just demonstrating competence. The pot, being an inanimate object, offered no feedback. Good, Ven continued. Low expectations. That's how we succeed. He adjusted the heat, added a measured amount of seasoning, then paused. Was that too much? He asked. The soup, maintaining its mysterious silence, refused to clarify. Ven sighed, leaned closer, and inhaled cautiously. It smelled fine. Not remarkable, but fine. Fine is good, he decided. Fine is safe. Fine doesn't create international incidents. He stepped back, wiping his hands on a cloth, and glanced around the apartment again. It looked different now. Not transformed, not suddenly impressive, but intentional. As if someone had, for once, considered how the space might be perceived rather than simply how it functioned. Ven nodded, satisfied. Look at that, he said. We're practically civilized. The door chime did not sound. He blinked, then checked the time. Right, he muttered. Still early. He paced once across the room, then again, then stopped himself. No, he said firmly. We're not doing that. He returned to the console, sat down and pulled up a set of transit schematics. Something familiar, something grounding. For a few minutes he managed to focus, tracing energy distributions and correcting a minor inefficiency that had been bothering him for days. Then he looked at the door again. Still closed, he observed. He leaned back, exhaled, and let his gaze drift upward. This is ridiculous, he said. It's just a visit. The words felt reasonable, sensible even. They did not feel entirely true. Ven stood again, walked to the table, adjusted one of the bowls by a fraction of a centimeter, then adjusted it back. Perfect, he said, with the confidence of someone who had lost all objectivity. He moved to the door, stopped just short of it, and hesitated. Not out of fear, but out of awareness. Something about this moment, the quiet before arrival, the stillness of the room, felt like the edge of something he could not yet define. He shook his head slightly. Relax, he told himself. She's just someone from a forum. A faint hum passed through the station structure, the distant vibration of a docking sequence initiating somewhere beyond his apartment. Ven tilted his head, listening. Well, he said softly, that's probably unrelated. He glanced at the door one more time. Then he straightened, took a slow breath, and waited. The door chime sounded once. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a single, polite tone that somehow carried far more weight than it had any right to. Ven froze. For a moment he considered pretending he hadn't heard it. This was not a serious option, but it existed briefly, like a small and useless escape route his brain insisted on presenting. The chime sounded again. Right, Ven said, straightening. We're doing this. He walked to the door with what he hoped was a normal pace, and what was, in reality, a carefully controlled sequence of steps designed to prevent him from either rushing or hesitating. He stopped in front of the panel, rested his hand near the control, then paused just long enough to realize there was no version of this moment that didn't involve opening it. Okay, he muttered. Just a person, just a visit. Probably not dangerous. He opened the door. Sai stood there. For half a second, nothing else existed. Not the apartment, not the station, not the faint hum of distant systems, just the simple, immediate fact of her presence. She looked exactly as she had sounded, which made no sense and yet felt entirely correct. Her features were human in structure, familiar in proportion, but there was something in the stillness of her posture, in the quiet precision of her gaze, that set her apart. And then there were her ears, long, elegantly shaped, impossible to ignore once noticed. Ven's brain processed this information efficiently. Then it noticed the figure standing 2 meters behind her. The escort did not move. He didn't need to. His presence alone carried the kind of quiet certainty that suggested movement would only make things worse for everyone involved. The armor he wore was not decorative. It was functional in the way that implied very serious conversations could end very quickly. Ven blinked. Okay, he said. Sai's expression shifted slightly. Not quite a smile, but something close to it. You didn't know, she said. It wasn't a question. Ven glanced at her, then at the escort, then back at her again, as if repeating the sequence might produce a different result. I had a suspicion, he replied carefully. It was less detailed than this. Sai inclined her head, acknowledging the statement without correcting it. That is understandable. There was a brief pause. Ven became aware that he was still standing in the doorway, effectively blocking entry to a situation that had already escalated beyond his control. Oh, he said, stepping aside. Right, you should come in. That's usually how visits work. Sai stepped forward. The movement was smooth, deliberate, and entirely unhurried. As she crossed the threshold, she turned slightly, her gaze shifting toward the escort. Wait here, she said. The escort did not respond verbally. He simply remained where he was, his stillness somehow becoming even more pronounced, as if the instruction had reinforced an already absolute state. Ven watched this exchange with the growing realization that he had, in fact, invited something far more complicated than he had anticipated. The door closed. The sound was soft, final. Sai took a few steps into the apartment, her attention moving across the space with quiet observation. She looked at the table, at the carefully arranged bowls, at the faintly flickering light that Ven had chosen to ignore rather than fix. She looked at the food, then she looked at Ven. Then, for reasons that would later occupy far more of his thoughts than seemed reasonable, she looked back at the food again. Ven followed her gaze as if checking whether something had changed in the last few seconds. It's soup, he said. Sai nodded once. I see that. Another pause. Ven shifted his weight slightly, suddenly aware that the entire situation had condensed into a single, absurdly simple fact. A person of clearly significant importance had entered his apartment and was now evaluating a meal he had prepared while arguing with his furniture. I can explain, he began, then stopped. He could not, in fact, explain anything about this. Sai stepped closer to the table. Her movements were precise but not rigid, controlled but not distant. There was a familiarity in the way she approached the setting, as if she had already accepted the situation rather than questioned it. She reached out, her fingers brushing lightly against the edge of the table, testing its stability. The table held. Ven exhaled quietly. Good table, he whispered. Sai glanced at him, the faintest hint of amusement appearing in her expression. You prepared this yourself, she said. Yes, Ven replied, with minimal casualties. She considered this. That is encouraging. Ven nodded, as if this were a perfectly normal evaluation of his cooking. I like to keep expectations realistic. Sai moved to one of the chairs and sat down. The action was simple, unremarkable, and yet, in that moment, the weight of everything Ven had not known settled into place with quiet clarity. She sat as someone who had always expected to be allowed to sit wherever she chose. Not arrogantly, not carelessly, just certainly. Ven remained standing for a second longer than necessary. Then he stepped forward, pulled out the other chair, and sat across from her. The distance between them was small, ordinary. Outside the door, somewhere beyond the thin barrier of his apartment, an armed escort stood waiting. Inside there was a table, 2 chairs, and a pot of soup that had suddenly become the most important object in the room. Sai looked at him again. You did not know, she repeated. Ven met her gaze, this time without looking away. No, he said. I didn't. A beat passed. Then, because there was nothing else to do, because the situation had already exceeded every reasonable expectation, and because some part of him refused to let it become anything other than what it was supposed to be. He reached for the pot. "I made soup," he said again. Sai watched him for a moment. Then finally she smiled. Ven poured the soup with the careful concentration of someone handling volatile materials, which, considering the situation, was not entirely inaccurate. "There," he said, placing the bowl in front of Sai. "Statistically safe." Sai looked down at the bowl as if it were a data point requiring verification. Steam rose slowly, curling between them. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. Ven sat back, picked up his own spoon, then paused. "Before we begin," he said, "I should clarify that this recipe has never been tested on royalty." Sai's eyes lifted to meet his. "I have eaten in less controlled environments," she replied. Ven blinked once. That is somehow reassuring and concerning at the same time. Sai tilted her head slightly, studying him with the same quiet attention she had shown in their conversations. Then, without ceremony, she picked up the spoon and tasted the soup. Ven watched. He tried not to watch. He failed. Sai did not react immediately. She seemed to consider the flavor, not critically, but carefully, as if identifying each element and placing it within a larger context. Ven resisted the urge to explain the seasoning choices, the cooking time, the minor panic he had experienced halfway through. Finally, she nodded. "It is good," she said. Ven exhaled. "Good as in acceptable, or good as in not a diplomatic incident?" Sai's expression shifted again, that almost smile returning. "Closer to the latter." Ven leaned back slightly. "I will take that as a victory." They began to eat. For a while the conversation remained simple. Not empty, but grounded in the immediate. Small observations, quiet exchanges that required no effort to maintain. The tension that had followed Sai's arrival did not disappear entirely, but it softened, folding itself into the background like a distant system hum. Ven gestured vaguely with his spoon. "So," he said, "on the forum, when you said long routes, I assumed you meant moderately inconvenient travel." Sai took another measured spoonful before answering. "That is one way to describe it." Ven nodded slowly. "And the escort outside? He is part of my security detail." "Of course he is." Ven paused, then added, "I don't suppose he also critiques transit theory in his spare time." Sai glanced toward the door, as if considering the possibility. "No," she said. "He does not enjoy discussions." Ven nodded again. "That checks out." A brief silence followed, not uncomfortable, just thoughtful. Ven set his spoon down, leaning forward slightly. "You could have told me," he said, "about all of this." Sai met his gaze without hesitation. "Yes," she said, "I could have." She did not offer an explanation immediately. Instead, she let the statement exist on its own, as if it were sufficient. Ven waited. Eventually she continued. "If I had told you," she said, "you would have behaved differently." Ven opened his mouth to argue, then stopped. He considered it. Then he nodded. "Yeah," he admitted. "Probably." Sai inclined her head slightly. "I did not want that." Ven leaned back again, studying her in a way that felt different now. Not more distant, but more aware. The pieces were there, if he chose to assemble them. The precision in her words, the controlled way she moved, the quiet authority that had filled the room the moment she entered. "You're important," he said. Sai did not react to the word itself. "I have responsibilities," and she replied. "That's a very careful way of saying yes." Sai's expression softened, just slightly. "Yes," she said. Ven let out a slow breath, then reached for his bowl again. "Okay," he said. "So I invited someone important over for soup. That's a new one." Sai watched him for a moment. "You are not concerned," she said. Ven shrugged. "I mean, I was," he admitted, "for about 3 seconds. Then I realized I had already committed to the situation." Sai's eyes narrowed slightly, not in suspicion, but in curiosity. "Committed?" Ven gestured toward the table. "I made soup," he said, as if that explained everything. For a moment Sai said nothing. Then unexpectedly she laughed. It was quiet but unmistakable. Ven blinked. "There it is," he said. I was wondering if that would happen again. Sai shook her head slightly, as if dismissing something only she could see. You are unusual, she said. Ven pointed at himself with his spoon. I've been saying that for years. No one listens. Sai studied him again, her gaze thoughtful. You speak as if nothing has changed, she said. Ven considered that. Then he leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice as if sharing a secret. Something has changed, he said. There's a very serious-looking person outside my door who could probably end my entire week in under a second. Sai did not deny this. But, Ven continued, sitting back again, inside this room, it's still just you and me. And the soup. Sai followed his gaze to the table, then back to him. For a moment, something in her expression shifted, something quieter, less defined by the role she carried beyond the door. Yes, she said softly. It is. The station hummed around them, systems moving, ships arriving and departing, lives intersecting in ways that rarely mattered beyond their immediate context. But here, in this small apartment, at this uneven table that had somehow survived inspection, a different kind of balance had formed. Ven picked up his spoon again. So, he said, if I accidentally insult your entire civilization at some point, is there a formal apology process, or do I just run? Sai tilted her head, considering. Running would not be effective, she said. Ven nodded. Good to know. A pause. Hypothetically, he added. Sai's eyes flickered with that same quiet amusement. Hypothetically, she agreed. The second bowl was unnecessary, which was exactly why Ven served it. Careful, he said as he placed it down. This is where confidence turns into over-engineering. Sai glanced at the additional portion, then at him. You are concerned about excess, she said. I am concerned about variables, Ven replied. 1 bowl proves competence. 2 bowls suggests I'm trying to impress you. 3 bowls means I've lost control of the situation entirely. Sai considered this with the seriousness of someone evaluating a system model. And 4? Ven didn't hesitate. That's a cry for help. Sai's lips curved again, that restrained amusement returning as she picked up her spoon. You have defined clear threshold, she said. I like structure, Ven replied. It makes chaos easier to schedule. They ate in a more relaxed rhythm now, the earlier tension having dissolved into something steadier. The quiet between them no longer felt like something that needed to be filled. It simply existed, shaped by small movements, by the soft sound of utensils against ceramic, by the distant, constant hum of the station. Sai set her spoon down first this time. You live here alone, she said. It wasn't a question. Ven nodded. Mostly, he said. There's a maintenance drone that visits occasionally, but I don't think it counts as company. It judges me. Sai glanced toward the ceiling, as if expecting to see it. In what way? Ven gestured vaguely upward. It pauses longer than necessary when it scans the room, like it's disappointed in my life choices. Sai's expression shifted, subtle, but unmistakable. You assign intent to machines, she said. I assign personality to anything that doesn't actively deny it, Ven replied. It makes things more interesting. Sai tilted her head slightly, studying him again. Does it work? Ven thought about that. Sometime, he said. Other times I argue with a wall panel for 10 minutes before realizing I'm the problem. Sai nodded once, as if that answer had confirmed something. I understand. Ven raised an eyebrow. Do you? Sai's gaze moved, not around the room this time, but inward, focused on something distant, something not present in the small apartment. My environment, she said slowly, does not allow for simplicity. Ven leaned back slightly. That sounds like a polite way of saying, everything is complicated all the time. Sai looked back at him. It is not polite, she said. It is accurate. A brief silence followed, but it carried a different weight now. Not awkward, not uncertain, but reflective. Ven rested his arms on the table. So the forum, he said, that's your version of arguing with wall panels. Sai's eyes flickered with recognition. Yes, she said. Ven nodded, satisfied. I knew it. Sai's fingers traced lightly along the edge of the table again. that same small, unconscious motion she had made earlier. There, she continued, I am not required to represent anything. Ven watched her for a moment. No titles, he said. No expectations, Sai replied. No escorts standing outside the door, Ven added. Sai's gaze shifted briefly in that direction. No. Ven exhaled slowly. Must be nice. Sai did not answer immediately. When she did, her voice was quieter. It is unfamiliar. Ven tilted his head. That's worse, he said. Sai looked at him. Worse? Yeah, Ven replied. Nice things are easy to enjoy when you're used to them. When you're not, you spend half the time wondering when they're going to disappear. Sai held his gaze for a second longer than usual. Then she looked down at the table again. You speak as if you have experience with that. Ven shrugged. Not on your scale, he said. But yeah, small things mostly. Sai nodded once, absorbing the statement without pressing further. The station hummed again, a subtle shift in frequency that suggested something large had docked or departed. Ven noticed it automatically, the way someone who had lived in the same environment for years could detect changes without consciously listening. Sai noticed it too. You are aware of the station's systems, she said. Ven smiled slightly. I have to be, he replied. If something changes, it usually means I have more work. Sai's expression shifted, curiosity threading through it. You maintain infrastructure. Among other things, Ven said. Mostly I fix things that shouldn't have broken in the first place. Sai considered that. That is a recurring pattern in complex systems, she said. Ven laughed quietly. That might be the most diplomatic way anyone has ever described my job. Sai tilted her head again. You find humor in inefficiency. I find humor in survival, Ven corrected. If I didn't, I'd spend all my time being annoyed. Sai's gaze lingered on him, thoughtful, measuring in a way that felt different now. Not analytical, but attentive. You are not annoyed, she said. Ven looked at her, then at the table, then back at her again. I was, he admitted. Before you got here. Sai's expression softened, just slightly. And now? Ven gestured vaguely between them. Now I'm having dinner with someone who casually mentions security detail like it's part of a normal conversation. Sai's lips curved again. That is not normal. No, Ven agreed, but it's interesting. A pause, then, with perfect timing. A faint, controlled knock sounded at the door. Not loud, not urgent, but precise. Ven froze mid-motion, his spoon hovering just above the bowl. He looked at the door, then at Sai, then back at the door again. Well, he said slowly, that doesn't sound like a maintenance drone. The knock came again. Same rhythm, same controlled precision, as if even the act of requesting entry had been optimized. Ven did not move. He stared at the door with the kind of focus usually reserved for unstable machinery. Good news, he said quietly. It's polite. Sai did not turn toward the door immediately. She remained seated, her posture unchanged, her attention still anchored to the space between them. Only her eyes shifted briefly, acknowledging the interruption without giving it control. They will not enter without permission, she said. Ven nodded slowly. That's reassuring, he replied. I appreciate boundaries, especially the kind that involve heavily armed individuals. The knock did not repeat. The silence that followed felt deliberate, like a held breath. Ven exhaled first. So, he said, setting his spoon down, on a scale from routine check-in to something has gone very wrong, where are we? Sai considered this. Closer to routine, she said. Ven leaned back slightly. Closer, he repeated. That's a flexible word. Sai's gaze returned to him. They are ensuring my safety, she said. Ven gestured lightly toward the door. I feel very safe, he said. Extremely safe. Possibly the safest I've ever been while eating soup. Sai's expression flickered again, that quiet amusement surfacing for a moment before settling. You are adapting, she said. I am surviving, Ven corrected. Adaptation is what I'll call it later, when I've had time to process. He stood up. The movement was slow, deliberate, as if he were giving himself time to reconsider. He didn't. Do I need to do anything? He asked. Sai shook her head. No. Ven nodded. Good, he said, because my plan was to pretend the door doesn't exist. Sai watched him for a moment. That would not be effective. Ven placed a hand on the back of his chair. It's been working so far, he said. Another second passed. Then Sai stood. The shift was subtle, but immediate. The room adjusted around her, not physically, not visibly, but in the way attention reorganizes itself when something important moves. The quiet ease she had carried at the table remained, but something else layered over it now. Not distance, not formality, presence. Ven noticed it. He did not comment on it. Sai stepped toward the door, her movements as controlled as they had been since the moment she arrived. She stopped just short of the panel, her hand hovering near it. Ven stayed where he was. This is the part, he said, where I remember I invited you here. Sai glanced back at him. Yes. Ven nodded once. Just checking. Sai opened the door. The escort stood exactly where he had been, unchanged, as if time had paused for him while it continued everywhere else. Behind him, the corridor extended in clean, sterile lines, illuminated by the station's steady light. There were others now. Not many. 2 additional figures, positioned further back. Their presence less immediate but no less intentional. Their armor matched the escort's, their stillness equally precise. Ven leaned slightly to the side, just enough to see them. Ah, he said softly. You brought friends. No one responded. Sai stepped into the doorway, not fully leaving the apartment, not fully remaining inside. The threshold became something more than a physical boundary, a line between 2 different versions of her. She spoke quietly, her voice carrying a tone Ven had not heard before. It was not louder, not sharper, but it carried weight in a way that made the air itself seem to listen. I am not to be disturbed unless necessary, she said. The escort inclined his head. Yes, my queen. Ven blinked. He did not react immediately. He simply stood there, absorbing the word as it settled into place, aligning everything he had already understood with everything he had not fully acknowledged. My queen. Right, Ven said under his breath. There it is. Sai remained still for a moment longer, ensuring the instruction had been received, understood, and accepted. Then she stepped back. The door closed. The sound once again was soft, final. The room shifted, not dramatically, not suddenly, but the balance had changed. Ven looked at Sai. Really looked this time, not just at the details, not just at the familiarity of her face or the distinct shape of her ears, but at the entirety of what she represented. You could have led with that, he said. Sai met his gaze. Yes, she said. Ven exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. Queen, he repeated, testing the word as if it might behave differently the second time. Sai did not correct him. That explains a few things, he continued. The escort, the additional escorts, the way you sit like the chair belongs to you. Sai tilted her head slightly. The chair does belong to you. Ven pointed at her. That's not the point. A pause. Then despite everything, Sai smiled. Ven stared at her for a second longer than necessary. Then he laughed. Not loudly, not uncontrollably, but genuinely. Okay, he said, shaking his head. Okay, this is fine. I'm fine. Sai stepped back toward the table, returning to her seat as if the interruption had been nothing more than a brief deviation. Ven watched her sit. The presence shifted again, softer, quieter. The room became what it had been before, almost. He walked back to his chair and sat down. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Ven picked up his spoon. Just to clarify, he said, if I say something inappropriate, do I get warned, or is it more of an immediate consequence situation? Sai looked at him, that same calm expression returning. You would be informed, she said. Ven nodded. Good, he replied. I prefer feedback. Sai's eyes held his for a moment. Then very slightly, she leaned forward, and the distance between them felt smaller than it had before. You have not been inappropriate, she said. Ven paused. Then he smiled. Give me time, he said. Sai's gaze lingered, something unspoken passing between them, something quieter than humor, but just as real. Outside the door, the guards remained. Inside, the soup had not changed, but the understanding had. The bowls were empty long before either of them acknowledged it. Ven turned his spoon once inside the ceramic, as if expecting more to appear out of habit rather than logic. It didn't. "Well," he said, "that's the end of my diplomatic strategy." Sai glanced at the table. It was effective. "That's concerning," Ven replied. "I don't have a second plan." Sai's gaze lifted to him again, steady, thoughtful in a way that had become familiar over the course of the evening. "You were not required to have one," she said. Ven leaned back in his chair, letting out a slow breath. "I feel like that's something people say right before consequences happen." Sai shook her head slightly. "No," she said. "It is something people say when expectations were not present." Ven considered that. "Then I exceeded expectations," he said. Sai tilted her head. "You met them," she corrected. Ven smiled faintly. "I'll take that." The room settled into a quiet that no longer felt temporary. Not waiting, not fragile, just complete. Ven stood, collecting the bowls with a casualness that would have been impossible earlier. He moved to the small cleaning unit, placing them inside with a practiced motion. "Don't interpret this as me rushing you out," he said over his shoulder. "I just don't trust myself to leave things for later. That's how systems fail." Sai watched him, her posture relaxed in a way that would have been unthinkable to anyone outside the room. "You maintain order," she said. "I try," Ven replied. "Mostly I prevent small problems from becoming larger ones." Sai's gaze followed him as he returned to the table. "That is a valuable skill," she said. Ven sat down again, this time without hesitation, without the careful awareness that had shaped his movements before. "Not usually," he said. "Most people only notice when something breaks." Sai studied him for a moment. "I noticed," she said. Ven blinked. He didn't respond immediately. Not because he didn't have an answer, but because for once the answer felt less important than the moment itself. "Yeah," he said quietly. "You did." A faint vibration passed through the station again, subtle, controlled. Not a docking sequence this time. Something else. Sai noticed it. Ven noticed her noticing it. "That's you," he said. Sai did not deny it. "My time is limited," she said. Ven nodded once. "I figured." He didn't ask how limited. He didn't ask what would happen next. Some things he had learned did not need to be defined to be understood. Sai stood. The movement was familiar now, but it carried a different weight. Not the shift from informal to formal, but the quiet return to something she could not set aside indefinitely. Ven remained seated for a second longer than necessary. Then he stood too. There was no distance between them now. Not really. The table, the room, the entire apartment had somehow become smaller over the course of the evening, not in size but in significance. Sai looked at him. "You invited me," she said. Ven nodded. "I did. You did not know who I was." "Still don't," Ven replied. "Not really." Sai considered that. "You know enough." Ven tilted his head slightly. "Yeah," he said. "I think I do." A pause. Then Sai stepped closer. Not formally, not as a gesture of authority, but simply as someone closing the space between two people who no longer needed it. "You treated me as if I were ordinary," she said. Ven shrugged lightly. "You acted like it," he replied. Sai's expression shifted again. Something quieter, something that belonged entirely to the version of her that had existed at the table. "That is rare," she said. Ven smiled. "So is good soup," he said. Sai let out a soft breath that might have been a laugh. "Your standards are inconsistent." "They adapt," Ven corrected. Another pause. This one longer. Not uncertain, just necessary. Sai turned toward the door. Ven didn't move. He watched her reach for the panel, watched the moment before the transition, the point where the evening would end and everything beyond it would resume. "Sai," he said. She stopped, not fully turning, but enough. Ven hesitated, not because he didn't know what to say, because he did. "If you ever need a place where nothing is expected," he said, "I'm usually here, arguing with machines, making statistically safe decisions." Sai looked at him, fully this time. "I know," she said. She opened the door. The corridor returned, bright, controlled, occupied. The escort stood where he had always been, unchanged, unwavering. But this time the difference was clear. Sai stepped forward, and the space around her shifted. Not because she changed, but because everything else adjusted to her presence. Ven remained inside. He didn't follow. He didn't need to. Sai paused at the threshold, just long enough to look back. Not as a queen, not as a figure of authority, just as herself. "It was good," she said. Ven nodded. "Yeah," he replied. "It was." She stepped out. The door closed. The room was quiet again. Ven stood there for a moment, then another, then finally let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Well," he said to no one in particular, "that happened." He looked at the table, at the empty space across from him, at the small details that had somehow carried more weight than they should have. Then he moved, not slowly, not thoughtfully, just naturally. He returned to the console, sat down and opened the form. For a second, nothing had changed. Threads scrolled. Arguments continued. Someone was still insisting that predictive optimism could stabilize transit lanes. Ven smiled. Then, a new message appeared. From Sai. "I have reviewed your last model. You are still wrong." Ven leaned back, staring at the screen. Then he laughed. "Of course I am," he said. He placed his hands on the console, already typing. "Then you should probably come back and explain it properly," he wrote. "I might even make more soup." He sent it without hesitation this time. The room hummed softly around him, unchanged and yet entirely different. Ven glanced once toward the door, then back to the screen, and waited, not for something extraordinary, just for a reply.